Good day. In today's video, I wanted to share with you a quick and easy to follow interview prep checklist. Okay, the first step you could do early on in your interview prep journey would be to document yourself about the opportunity. And this step comprises of smaller steps such as looking up the company online, reading about their core values, their leadership principles, the company culture, and the other document that's essential to consult during your documentation would be the job description. Okay, the job description can contain some really interesting stuff for you to focus on in your interview prep journey. However, you should keep in mind the way these job descriptions are made is they design it once and then they slightly change it whenever there's a new opening for the next 5 to 10 years, right? So they're expensive to build from the ground up, and that's why you should set the right expectations from this job description and don't expect them to share what they're actually looking for on the ideal candidate, because those are things that I'm going to talk about later on in the process, right? Another thing you'd want to stay away from would be pushing for insider info from your recruiter or whomever your point of contact is, because what happens is this can easily backfire. For instance, if you push the recruiter, hey recruiter, what is some tips, what is some most commonly asked types of questions, will my interview be technical or behavior, they might take it on the wrong end, and they might even expedite the process with giving you some conflicting or misleading information, right? So the first step, the documentation, where there's the easy stuff, you should make it a learning experience, right? The second step in your interview prep checklist is where you want to actually improve your interviewing skills, right? Improving interviewing skills depends from person to person, can take from 1 year to a few days, but I can simplify this process into two main areas. First is your story bank, and the second is the role play. You cannot have the one without the other, right? So you could have the best story bank in the world. If you cannot communicate it, it will not matter much. You can be the best communicator in the world. You can be a speaker. I've had plenty of candidates who are great speakers, but who lacked substance from their story banks. So that's why their performance wasn't the best, right? So story banks and role play. Okay, story banks, why bother with the story bank? Well, to get content that you can share with your interviewer. Maybe some of you will have experiences that are more than 5 years old, so you would want to spend a little bit of time to remember all the key details. Maybe you'd want to ensure that you prepare some of the more commonly asked type of interview questions, the introductory statements, maybe some questions around some behavioral competencies, and these sort of things, right? How many stories? Well, around 20, so to speak. But if interviewing should be your strength, especially for more seniors or manager types of roles, then you should trend towards something like 30 types of stories, which you should revise at least 3 times. Okay, what types of stories do you need? Well, the best approach I recommend would be not to focus on lists of commonly asked questions, but rather on models of behavioral competencies, right? A model of behavioral competency could be Amazon's leadership principles. That's the most basic example I give to people. Or if you want, there's also plenty of other behavioral competency models online, but the problem is they're too big. They focus on 20 or 30 core competencies that I believe, in my experience, are very hard to follow if you want to build a story bank for a job interview, right? I also cover this in my training program, because there the objective is that you focus on a simplified set of aptitudes or core competencies in order to have the shortest possible path to a great story bank, right? So things such as customer obsession, or conflict resolution, or dealing with ambiguity, learning and innovation, and stuff like that. This is my simplified model, but again, you can find any of these online if you want, right? The second part with the role play, why would anyone bother with role play? Well, in my experience, everyone should bother with role play and most people bother with role play because they have a challenging time communicating their experiences for the purpose of job interview. And this can be for various reasons, the most basic of which could be you're unintelligible, okay, or the more complicated ones, things such as how to better sell yourself on your ability to, to be a data-driven individual, a topic I just covered in the video yesterday. So a role play can be a super beneficial approach to building your critical thinking skills, because most often in my coaching sessions it becomes obvious from the first few minutes of our discussions of our role plays on how good or not a candidate is when it comes to communicating in a job interview and reading a little bit between the lines of this, right? Remember, these things go hand in hand. You cannot have a story bank but just do role play. You cannot do just role play without having a story bank, right? The third step in your interview prep journey should be, a few days before your job interview, let's say 3 days before the interview, when, stress and anxiety increase, so that's when probably you'd want to focus on the more easier stuff for your upcoming job interview, such as preparing questions for them. Right? It's a lot easier to prepare questions for them than to prepare your story bank. Or if you want, you could also refresh your notes, your story bank, eventually turn it into a set of cheat sheets if you believe that's the best approach for you. You could also check your technical stuff, such as your connection, your sound, your video quality, and stuff like that. The enjoyable stuff, right? That will probably improve your mood in the process. And some people can also will also consider recording their upcoming job interviews. Whether that's legal or not depends where you live, but recording your job interview can also be a golden mine for later on, and I'm going to talk about this towards the end of this video, right? But keeping your motivation levels, keeping yourself engaged 3 days or less before the interview are critical components I found, right? Then number 4, during the actual job interview or right before your actual job interview, you should keep in mind that you should never interrupt your interviewer, right? It sounds easy, but it's far more complicated in my experience. Or also you should listen carefully to what they're actually asking during these job interviews, because the candidates who perform best in these job interviews are the ones who are the best listeners. If you can read your interviewer, you're already halfway there, right? Use your best answers. If you have a story bank, you'll probably know, you also have performed a qualitative approach, your best stories, and you would want to over focus on those as well. And, exhibiting leadership and backbone if needed be in contemporary job interviews, also stuff that sells pretty well, right? Now, number 5, after your job interview. So after your job interview, what I recommend everyone, regardless of your performance went, would be to spend a little bit of time with a post-mortem. Right? A post-mortem basically means to write down the questions you got asked and to maybe map those questions with the stories that you used to answer them, right? If you chose to record your job interview, then a post-mortem will be, those recordings will represent a golden mine for you to better understand your performance, even if you got the job, by the way. So I found there's tremendous value in recording those. Sometimes people even ask me to cross-check. Hey, Dan, what do you think about my performance here? How did it went? Where can I improve? Right? So these recordings yield some amazing insight if you choose to go that route, of course. Another thing you could do after your job interview would be to send thank you notes. Okay, in some companies, in some places, it's more appropriate than in others. Maybe you'd want to keep in touch with your interviewer, I don't know, through LinkedIn or stuff like that. I don't necessarily recommend it, but if it's something that everyone does, then you could also consider it, right? So you should check online first if that's normal, right? With respect to communication after your job interview, that very much depends on how many offers you have lined up, right? Whether you're interviewing with anyone else, with other companies, because what happens when early on in the process you'll get asked, hey, are you interviewing with some other companies right now? And sometimes you will say, yes, I do have interviews, I'm interviewing with other companies. So then you have a bit of leverage to ask them to follow up with them after your job interview. Hey, what's going on? How long will it take you to decide? Because I do have some competing job offers, right? But if you don't, if you're only interviewing with them, then you should leave, a little bit of room, leave them as, I don't know, 2 weeks for them to get back to you. And if they don't, then you would follow up to see how that went. All right, so this was my interview prep checklist. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.